Hello, this is another one of my videos on Untitled Parker's short introduction to the Second World War, this one dealing with the American economy and also quickly mentioning combined boards. It comes from Chapter 9, Economies at War, which, because of its length, I've split up into a lot of separate videos. The triumphant success of the American war economy was partly due to its higher productivity. Mass production, utilizing designing and engineering skills, made as many weapons as the Allies could use. So the Americans were providing weapons for their British and Soviet allies as well as themselves. For example, Ford Motors set up a completely new factory at Willow Run near Detroit, employing over 42,000 workers. It produced 8,685 B-24 Liberator bombers, reaching a rate of one new plane per hour. Again, Henry Kaiser developed yards for constructing Liberty ships by welding together prefabricated parts. By late 1942, the average production time was 56 days for one ship, and one shipyard even produced one in 14 days. By 1944, the Americans were producing about 40% of all weapons being made everywhere on either side. Simultaneously, the average standard of living for Americans rose. Total civilian consumption grew by about 12% over the course of the war. Government demand brought unemployed resources into use and stimulated increased productivity. It was financed mainly by a huge deficit, $57 billion in 1943, about half of which came from the banking sector. Taxes in the same year raised only $22 billion. The depression of the 1930s was finally overcome, and unemployment almost disappeared. At 6 million in July 1940, before America joined the war, it fell to a mere 780,000 by 1943. Over the same period, the number of women employed rose from 13.8 million to 18.7 million, and average working hours per week rose from 37.3 to 45.3. Industrial production of civilian goods declined by about 1/3 compared to 1940, and civilians were not able to buy such items as new radios, cars, and washing machines. Despite restrictions and shortages, customers spent 1/3 more in retail shops in 1944 in real terms than they had between 1935 and 1939. Poor spent more, the rich spent less. After the Japanese conquest of Malaya in 1941 had cut off most of the world's supply of natural rubber, new synthetic rubber filled the gap, as in Germany, producing 800,000 tons by 1944, 50% more than the entire American consumption of rubber in 1939. To reduce rubber consumption, the government restricted motoring for pleasure and rationed petrol, so that on average cars travelled 1/3 fewer miles in 1943 than in 1941. After Pearl Harbor, the armed services spent lavishly on weapons. In the first half of 1942, they placed contracts for $100 billion worth of weapons, more than the total value of American production in even the most prosperous year before that. This led to a disorganized scramble and to stoppages when factories ran out of raw materials for particular contracts. The War Production Board, created in 1942, forbade the non-essential use of scarce materials, and from the end of 1942 organized priorities by giving the various procurement agencies quotas of scarce materials such as steel, aluminium, and copper, so that producers could plan their output. Although labour became scarce in some areas in 1942 and 43, especially on the West Coast, labour shortages never became critical in the United States as a whole. Employers dealt with the shortage of skilled workers by breaking down and simplifying skilled jobs, training new workers, and promoting partially trained workers. Although direction of labour on the British model was suggested, it wasn't accepted. Instead, area production committees arranged labour priorities on the West Coast for firms doing essential work. Overall production priorities were established by the Office of War Mobilization, set up in May 1943 under James F. Brines. This is Brines, a former American Senator for South Carolina and Associate Justice on the Supreme Court, Director of the Office of Economic Stabilization from October 1942 until May 43, and then Director of the Office of War Mobilization from May 43 through to July 45. He was later Secretary of State and Governor of South Carolina. The Americans' estimate for how many troops they needed varied considerably during the war. Ultimately, the US met the demands of the war easily because the Red Army engaged most of the German army. In autumn 1941, when it was assumed that the Germans would knock the Soviets out of the War Department planned to create an American army of 213 divisions. And in September 1942, when the German summer offensive against the Soviets seemed irresistible, the American General Staff estimated that 350 divisions would be required to win the war. But later estimates were much lower, down to 100 divisions by June 1943 and 90 divisions in early 1944. In May 1944, believing that the Soviets would be able to continue until the defeat of Germany, General Marshall opined that the US military had staked their success on their air superiority, the high quality of their fresh and well-equipped ground troops, and on Soviet numerical predominance. Let's turn now to the combined boards. These secured Anglo-American cooperation on supply issues, just as the combined chiefs of staff arranged military integration. They advised on the allocation of joint resources and munitions, shipping, raw materials and food, and a combined production resources board rationalized production. Canada also joined the food and raw materials boards. Just as the Soviets' military command didn't discuss strategy and operation with its Western allies, the Soviet Union simply presented lists of its material needs without discussion. Although the Americans increasingly outstripped the British in their capacities, the British members of these boards maintained an equality of influence due to their acknowledged skill and knowledge. Together, the British and Americans used their political and economic power, especially their near monopoly of world shipping, to lead and direct the newly forming United Nations and, Parker says, effectively rule the non-Axis world. So thank you for listening, and particular thanks to my patrons for their kind support and encouragement. Without them, I wouldn't be able to make these videos. You're very welcome to support my channel. Please do like, comment and share on the videos. Ring the bell button. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos. If you want to provide practical support, I'll give Patreon and PayPal links below. Next week will be two subjects, inflation and Italy. Have a good day.